Arthur Hayes opened his eyes. Not at once, but slowly, his eyelids feeling leaden, as though reluctant to part with the last vestiges of sleep. In those first moments, his consciousness grasped at the silence, but it was an illusion. Silence aboard the International Space Station was a relative concept, more the absence of harsh sounds than complete stillness. The familiar low-frequency hum, the constant companion of life in orbit, was already filling his ears. It emanated from the life support systems, the ventilation, the countless instruments sustaining this man-made island in the void. This hum had become the background noise, so commonplace the brain learned to filter it out, noticing only deviations from the norm. And there it was, a deviation. The very sound that had pulled Arthur from sleep, a distant, intermittent tapping. It had begun a moment before he woke and ceased almost as soon as he opened his eyes, leaving behind only a faint echo and a sense of inexplicable unease. The sound was unfamiliar, alien to the station's ordered acoustic landscape. It resembled neither the operation of machinery nor the random collision of objects in zero gravity. There was something methodical about it, almost deliberate. Arthur froze, listening intently. Only the hum. Had he imagined it? A mind still drowsy could play strange tricks. He blinked several times, chasing away the lingering drowsiness. His sleeping quarters, more akin to a vertical cocoon than a bed, was plunged into darkness. Thick shutters over the porthole and on the capsule walls reliably blocked out any light. This was essential for maintaining a circadian rhythm here, where the sun rose and set 16 times every 24 hours. Without this artificial night and a strict schedule, the human body would quickly lose its temporal bearings, plunging into a state of perpetual jet lag, exhausting and debilitating. Arthur turned his wrist, activating the backlight on his watch. Bright green numerals showed 4:53. There was still over an hour until the official wake-up call. 6 a.m. marked the start of the workday on the ISS, lasting until 9 p.m. 15 hours of intense work, scheduled with incredible precision. The entire schedule was broken down into 5-minute intervals. Experiments, equipment maintenance, communication sessions with Earth, meals, physical exercise, personal hygiene. Everything adhered to a strict timetable. Even a trip to the restroom had its designated time slot. This packed schedule was dictated by the enormous volume of tasks and the limited duration of each crew member's stay on the station. Every minute here was accounted for. Every second mattered. Arthur closed his eyes, trying to drift back to sleep. His body, accustomed to the absence of gravity, floated relaxed inside the sleeping bag. The bag itself was secured to the wall with special straps to prevent drifting during sleep and colliding with other crew members or equipment. The station was home to 10 people. This was more than the standard capacity of the modules, designed for 6. There had been periods in the past when up to 13 astronauts were aboard simultaneously. Each additional person meant extra supplies of food, water, toiletries, personal belongings. All this required space, and space on the ISS was the most precious resource. Every cubic centimeter was accounted for and functionally utilized. Which was precisely why the thought of someone else possibly being present, an 11th unaccounted-for occupant, seemed utterly absurd and simultaneously terrifying. But that strange tapping, so foreign and out of place, had stirred that very thought somewhere on the periphery of his consciousness. The idea of an uninvited guest wasn't new. It had been hovering in the air for several weeks, indistinct as a blurred image in an old photograph, yet persistent. Arthur wasn't the first to notice the oddities. It all began with small things, almost imperceptible deviations from the routine, easily dismissed as fatigue, absent-mindedness, or the peculiarities of life in a confined space with limited resources. Peripheral vision sometimes caught fleeting movement where there should be none. In the corners of modules, behind equipment racks, in dimly lit passageways. A split-second flicker, a shadow that instantly dissolved the moment one turned their head. Initially, Arthur attributed it to the play of light and shadow, to tricks of the eye caused by constant strain and the unusual environment. In zero gravity, objects sometimes drifted slowly, creating the illusion of movement. But these ephemeral glimpses felt different. They seemed purposeful, as if someone, or something, was deliberately avoiding direct sight, hiding in blind spots. Like a desert mirage, these shadows teased and eluded, leaving behind only a faint sense of disquiet. Other oddities compounded these visual anomalies: soft rustlings, inexplicable creaks emanating from ventilation grills or from behind wall panels, sounds that could easily be mistaken for the normal operation of station systems, if not for their unpredictable occurrence and their timing coinciding with those fleeting movements in the shadows. Most alarming, however, was the disappearance of items. First, a couple of snack packs of nuts went missing from the communal food supply. Then, several drink pouches. Later, someone couldn't find a spare t-shirt left out to dry after a workout. More personal items vanished, too. A tube of toothpaste, a small souvenir from Earth belonging to Eva Rostova, the crew commander. The initial reaction was suspicion. In a closed group, under conditions of constant stress and isolation, tensions can manifest in the most unexpected ways. The unpleasant thought arose that one of the crew members might be suffering from kleptomania, or simply wasn't coping with the psychological stress, secretly taking more than their share or appropriating others' belongings. It was an ugly but plausible theory. Several informal meetings were held where everyone, striving for calm and objectivity, shared their observations. They spoke quietly, avoiding direct accusations, but the atmosphere grew increasingly tense. However, weeks of careful observation of each other and the communal supplies failed to reveal the culprit. All 10 crew members were experienced professionals who had undergone rigorous selection and psychological screening. The idea that one of them was capable of petty theft under these conditions seemed increasingly unlikely. Moreover, the disappearances continued despite heightened vigilance. Food and water vanished in small quantities, but regularly. Small personal items went missing. This created an oppressive sense of mistrust and uncertainty. If it wasn't one of us, then who? Or what? The thought of a stowaway, someone who had somehow sneaked aboard, seemed fantastical, but alternative explanations were running dry. Arthur recalled one of the recent discussions. Dr. Kenji Tanaka, the biologist, had hypothesized it might be a microorganism or fungus unknown to science, aggressively consuming organic matter. But this hypothesis didn't explain the disappearance of non-edible items. Eva Rostova insisted on a glitch in the inventory systems or cargo delivery logistics, but admitted this didn't account for the visual and auditory anomalies. The very notion of an 11th crew member hiding somewhere in the bowels of the station was so incredible it was barely voiced aloud. But it was felt. It hid in the same shadows where the elusive movements flickered. It whispered in the soft rustlings and creaks. And now it had returned with that strange, methodical tapping that had broken the pre-dawn silence. Tap. Tap, tap. The sound repeated, louder this time, more distinct. It didn't resemble random noise. There was a rhythm to it, almost an insistence. As if someone were rapping knuckle against metal, carefully, yet deliberately. The sound vibrated through the station structure, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Arthur lay motionless, holding his breath. His heart beat faster, thudding dully in his ears, mingling with the low hum of the life support systems. The unease, dormant on the periphery of his consciousness, instantly sharpened, morphing into a cold, unpleasant knot in his stomach. He strained his ears, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound. Useless. The station's acoustics were complex. Sounds readily bounced off metal walls, becoming distorted, changing direction. But intuition told him the source was nearby, perhaps just outside his sleeping capsule, in the corridor of the tranquility module. Silence again. Only the steady hum and his own breathing. Arthur exhaled slowly. Could it just be thermal stresses in the station's hull? Metal expands and contracts with temperature shifts as the station passed into Earth's shadow or emerged into sunlight. Sounds like that, clicks, faint crackles, were familiar. But this was different. The tapping was too rhythmic, too intentional. It didn't sound like the natural noises of cooling or heating metal. The hairs on the back of his neck prickled. It was an instinctive reaction to the inexplicable, to potential danger. His mind demanded a logical explanation, but his body was already sounding alarms. Lying there and waiting was unbearable. The not knowing was more frightening than a potential encounter with the source of the sound. He had to find out what was happening. Arthur made a decision. He carefully unzipped his sleeping bag. Movement in zero gravity required care and precision. A sudden shove could send him tumbling through the cabin. He slowly emerged from his cocoon, trying not to make a sound. It was difficult to orient himself in the darkness, but years of training and months living in orbit had ingrained almost automatic navigational skills. His hands instinctively found the handrails mounted on the walls and ceiling at regular intervals. He pushed off the capsule wall, moving smoothly toward the exit of his cramped personal space. The tranquility module, housing the sleeping quarters and hygiene facilities, was immersed in silence, broken only by the rhythmic, soft breathing of a colleague in a nearby capsule. No light seeped through the gaps in the other capsule's shutters. Everyone was asleep. Arthur moved as quietly as possible, gripping the handrails, pulling his body forward. Every creak of a fastening, every rustle of his flight suit seemed deafening in the pre-dawn quiet. He felt like an intruder, sneaking through a sleeping house. Tap, tap, tap. Again. The sound came from somewhere ahead, in the direction of the U.S. laboratory module, Destiny. It seemed slightly closer now, a bit more insistent. Arthur paused at the exit of Tranquility, peering into the dim corridor. Faint emergency lighting from control panels cast long, distorted shadows from equipment and wall-mounted containers. These shadows seemed to have a life of their own, swaying slightly with the air currents from the ventilation system, creating the illusion of movement where there was none. But now Arthur was certain it wasn't an illusion. Something, or someone, was up ahead, making that strange, disturbing sound. He had to know what it was. Overcoming an internal resistance, a mixture of fear and curiosity, he pushed off from the doorway and slowly floated forward, into the dim corridor, toward the unknown. Arthur moved forward slowly, striving for silence. His weightless body glided easily along the walls, but every movement demanded control and concentration. His hands moved from one handrail to the next, guiding his passage through the narrow passageway connecting the Tranquility module to the Harmony node, which served as the central hub of the station's U.S. segment. Here, the equipment hum was slightly louder. Life support, power distribution, and thermal control systems were at work. The faint glow of indicators on the panels cast greenish and orange reflections on the metal surfaces, creating the atmosphere of a complex, yet sleeping machine. The tapping stopped as soon as Arthur left the living quarters. The silence, broken only by the hum, pressed in on his ears again. He paused for a moment, listening. Nothing. Had the sound actually come from tranquility after all? Had one of his colleagues woken up and accidentally dropped or bumped something? But why, then, had the sound seemed to come from ahead? Echoes in the station's confined spaces could play tricks, distorting the perception of direction. He turned left, entering the U.S. laboratory module, Destiny. This was the heart of scientific research in the U.S. segment. A long cylinder densely packed with racks of experimental equipment, sample containers, monitors, and complex instruments. Wires and cables snaked along the walls, disappearing into panels. Even in the dim light, one could sense the high concentration of technology and knowledge. It was even quieter here than in Harmony. Only the faint whirring of a few active experiments disturbed the background hum. Arthur floated slowly past racks of expensive equipment. His gaze swept over containers holding biological samples, the result of years of research into the effects of space on living organisms. He tried not to dwell on what might have been making that strange tapping sound. His mind offered rational explanations: an unsecured tool, a system malfunction, a micrometeoroid impact, though that usually came with a sharp, loud crack, not methodical tapping. Tap, tap, tap. The sound was back. Now it was definitely coming from ahead and slightly to the left, from the direction of the Japanese experiment module, Kibo. No doubt about it, the source was there. But that was even stranger. According to the schedule, no one should have been in Kibo at this hour. All planned work there didn't start until 7 a.m. Arthur felt a chill run down his spine. He quickened his pace, pushing off the handrails a little harder. Floating through the length of Destiny, he reached the hatchway leading into Kibo. The hatch was standard, with a heavy round door and a locking lever. He pulled the lever, the mechanism clicked softly, and the hatch yielded. Arthur peered inside. The Japanese module Kibo was more spacious than the American one, with a large pressurized section and an external experiment platform accessible through a separate airlock. Right now, the main section was empty and quiet. The lights were dimmed. Only standby lighting highlighted the outlines of equipment and workstations. No movement. No sign of anyone's presence. Arthur floated cautiously inside, looking around. Everything was in its place. Equipment racks, monitors, tools, everything looked as it should during the station's night cycle. The tapping had stopped. Once again, he was alone with the station's hum and his own rapid breathing. He slowly floated toward the center of the module, carefully scanning every corner, every shadow. Nothing. Absolutely nothing suspicious. Had he imagined it all? Was the sound merely a figment of his imagination, born of accumulated fatigue and the subconscious anxiety over the missing items? Click, click, click. A different sound, sharp, abrupt. It came from behind Arthur, from the direction of the hatchway he had just entered Kibo through. He spun around sharply in the zero gravity, instinctively throwing his hands up. His heart hammered so hard it felt like it was trying to break out of his chest. A bead of sweat broke free from his temple and floated slowly upward, a glistening sphere in the dim light. Who's there? What was that? Silence. Again, only the hum and the pounding of his own heart. Arthur stared tensely into the darkness of the passageway leading back to Destiny. Nothing moved. Could it just have been the hatch mechanism making a noise as it settled? But he hadn't closed the hatch completely, only pushed it partially shut. He braced his feet against the opposite wall of the module, preparing to push off like a swimmer kicking off the side of a pool. The thought of returning back the way he came seemed the only sensible course. Echoes. Yes, that must have been it. Echoes. Or the sound had traveled through the hall from somewhere else. He'd simply misjudged the direction.
That initial tapping he'd heard, it must have come not from Kibo, but from the European laboratory module, Columbus, which was located further along from Destiny. Yes, that was it. He'd just pinpointed the source incorrectly. The thought brought some relief, though it was blatant self-deception. Deep down, Arthur knew the sound had clearly come from Kibo, and then shifted behind him. But admitting that meant acknowledging the presence of something inexplicable and potentially dangerous. It was easier to convince himself he'd made a mistake. He pushed off the wall and floated smoothly back toward the hatchway. Slipping through the opening, he was back in the Destiny module. Now he headed for its opposite end, toward the node connecting to Harmony and, beyond that, Columbus. He needed to check this theory. He needed to find a rational explanation. He tried to ignore the growing anxiety, the clammy sense of fear that gripped him ever tighter. A voice in his head insisted this was all wrong, illogical, dangerous. That he should return to his capsule, lock himself in, and wait for morning. But another voice, the voice of curiosity and professional duty, urged him onward. What if one of his colleagues woke up now? What if they saw him here, wandering the dark modules long before wake-up? They might suspect him. In light of the recent disappearances, his behavior would seem odd. They might decide he was the one, the klepto-astronaut, stealing food and belongings. He needed an explanation ready, just in case. He decided he'd say he couldn't sleep and had decided to get an early start on his exercise routine. It was plausible enough. Every crew member was required to spend at least 2 hours a day on special exercise equipment to prevent muscle atrophy and bone density loss in zero gravity. Exercise also helped combat the fluid shift in the body that caused facial puffiness and nasal congestion, the so-called space sniffles. An early workout, a perfectly valid reason to be outside his sleeping capsule. Yes, that's what he'd say if caught. In any case, he needed to find out about the sound. He needed to understand if it was somehow connected to that elusive stowaway the crew had been whispering about more often. Fear warred with determination, but for now, determination was winning.
He reached the end of the Destiny module and was about to enter the passageway to Harmony when the sound changed. The methodical tapping stopped abruptly, cut off mid-beat. It was replaced by a different sound, far more unpleasant and frightening. A sound like fingernails scraping across a blackboard, only amplified immensely. Metallic, screeching. It grew louder by the second, becoming higher-pitched and more piercing, making him instinctively cringe. This sound was unlike anything Arthur had ever heard on the station. It was alien, destructive. It sounded as if the very metal of the station's hull were groaning under some external force. The source of the sound now felt like it wasn't ahead, not in Columbus, but somewhere beneath him, outside the station. As if something huge, with sharp claws, were scraping along the outer hull, directly beneath the floor of the American module where he now floated. The scraping noise slowly shifted, moving back toward the Harmony node and further, toward the Tranquility Living module, where Arthur had begun his journey. Panic washed over Arthur in a wave. This wasn't just inexplicable. It was dangerous. Whatever was making that noise outside could damage the station's hull. Depressurization, the worst nightmare for any astronaut. He spun around and pushed off the wall with all his might, hurtling back down the corridor of the Destiny module. He had to warn the others. He had to get to a comm panel. He flew through the Harmony module, housing the main life support and power systems. The hum was louder here, but even it couldn't drown out the escalating screech coming from outside. The sound was so intense, it seemed the very deck plating beneath him was vibrating, although the concepts of floor and ceiling were relative in zero gravity. He noticed movement ahead. Lights had come on in the tranquility module. Someone was awake. Thank God, he wasn't alone. The scraping under the station continued, growing louder and more furious. The sound of tearing metal, of scraping claws, it evoked a primal terror. What could make sounds like that in a vacuum? What kind of creature or mechanism was capable of such a thing? Arthur raced through the Destiny module, trying to move as fast as possible, grabbing handholds almost without looking. His heart pounded wildly, adrenaline flooding his system. He flew past equipment racks, past portholes covered by thick shutters. And then a thought struck him. The cupola observation module. It was located right in this part of the station, attached to the tranquility module, but could also be accessed from Destiny. If the source of the sound was outside, maybe he could see it? It was risky, getting distracted at a moment like this, but the urge to understand overpowered the fear. He abruptly changed course, pulling himself toward the control panel for the cupola's window, the one facing down toward Earth. His fingers found the button to open the protective shutter. A second's hesitation, then he pressed it. The mechanism operated silently, and the heavy metal shutter slid slowly aside, revealing the abyss beyond. Beyond the thick, multi-layered window pane spread the familiar yet breathtaking panorama. The infinite blackness of space, sprinkled with myriad unwavering points of starlight. And below the station, filling most of the view, Earth drifted slowly by. A vast blue, white, and brown sphere, enveloped in the thin, luminous aura of its atmosphere. The view was mesmerizing, but that wasn't what Arthur was looking for now. He scanned the space immediately adjacent to the station, the area from which the hideous scraping sound had come. And he saw it. Not right away. At first, it seemed merely a dark patch against the starry backdrop, but then the patch took shape, drew closer. It was a person, one of the crew members. He was outside, without a spacesuit, clad only in a flight suit. His body was motionless, frozen in an unnatural posture, covered in a thin layer of frost, sparkling in the reflected light from Earth. The face, contorted in a final rictus of horror and asphyxiation, was turned toward the station. The eyes, wide open, seemed glazed with ice. The bluish tint of the skin left no doubt. He was dead, frozen solid in the vacuum of space. And it was his body, or rather, his gloved hand, scraping against the station's hull as something dragged it along the exterior. That was the source of the nightmarish sound, but what was dragging him? Arthur looked closer, and his blood ran cold. Wrapped around the dead astronaut's neck and face was something dark, blacker than the void itself. It resembled a thick, flexible tentacle, devoid of any features, simply a patch of absolute darkness against the stars. The tentacle extended away, disappearing into the darkness, as if belonging to some vast, unseen creature lurking near the station. It was slowly but inexorably pulling the body away from the ISS. Arthur recognized the dead man. It was Marcus Bell, the life support systems specialist. The cheerful guy from Houston, always ready with a joke. Now his frozen face was a mask of unutterable suffering. Arthur couldn't look away. He saw the dark tentacle shift slightly, and short, sharp spikes extended from its surface, digging deeper into the frost-covered skin of Marcus's neck. The body twitched slightly at the movement and continued its slow drift away from the station. That methodical tapping that had woken Arthur, that must have been Marcus's body bumping against the hull as he was being pulled out through an airlock. And then the scraping began as he was dragged along the hull. His thoughts scrambled, horror paralyzing his will. Marcus, dead, outside, being dragged away by some unimaginable black tentacle. It was incomprehensible. It felt like a nightmare, the delirium of a fevered mind. Marcus Bell's body drifted slowly farther away, shrinking to a barely visible speck before finally dissolving into the bottomless black of space. Gone, as if he had never been there. Arthur stared into the void, trying to process what he had seen. The scraping had stopped. Relative silence returned, broken only by the station's hum and his own ragged breathing. He was still clinging to the handrail by the window, feeling his hands tremble. It was real. It had just happened. Shock held Arthur paralyzed. He kept staring out the window, though there was nothing left to see but the stars and the distant earth. The image of Marcus's frozen face, entwined by the black tentacle, was seared into his vision. The cold vacuum, the lack of air, the instant freezing. Marcus's death had been horrific, unimaginable. And that creature, what was it? Where had it come from? Was it still out there, near the station? Tears welled in his eyes, but in zero gravity they didn't stream down his cheeks, instead forming small, trembling spheres that detached and floated in the air before him. Arthur wiped them away, trying to regain control. He needed to act, to tell the others, to contact Earth. He pushed off from the window, intending to head for the command post. "What did you see out there?" The voice came from close by, at the end of the American module, just ahead of him. Arthur flinched and whipped around. Someone else woken by the noise, he thought. Now he'd have to somehow explain what he'd seen, try to convey the nightmare in words. "It's Marcus. Arthur began, but his voice broke. Tears blurred his vision again. How could he explain that he'd just seen the dead body of Marcus Bell being dragged into space by something indescribable? He looked up and froze. Before him, illuminated by the faint light from the control panels, floated the person who had asked the question. The person he had just seen dead outside the window. Marcus Bell. Alive and apparently unharmed. He hung in the air opposite Arthur, head tilted slightly, an expression of curiosity on his face. No frost, no bluish tint to his skin, no signs of asphyxiation. Just normal Marcus in his standard flight suit. "Marcus?" Arthur breathed, feeling an icy chill run down his spine again, but of a different kind this time. It was impossible. He couldn't have been mistaken. He had clearly seen his body, his face. "Yeah? What's wrong, Arthur? You look pale. And what was all that noise? Did you find our stowaway?" A smile spread across Marcus's face, but there was something wrong with the smile, something subtly alien. And in that instant, Arthur noticed. The skin on Marcus's face and neck, it didn't seem entirely still. Beneath the surface, there seemed to be some kind of faint movement, a slight ripple, as if large insects or worms were shifting slowly just underneath. It lasted only a fraction of a second, but Arthur saw it. He had no time to process it or react. Other crew members emerged from the Tranquility module: Eva Rostova, Kenji Tanaka, Lena Petrova, the flight engineer. They too had been awakened by the noise and were now looking anxiously at Arthur and Marcus.
"What's going on here? Why are you two awake?" Eva asked, her voice calm but firm. Arthur slowly shook his head, still unable to believe his eyes. He shifted his gaze from Marcus's face to his arriving colleagues and back. It was him. Or was it? There was a sound. Tapping, Arthur mumbled. The more he thought about what he'd seen outside the window, the more unreal it all seemed.
Had he been asleep after all? Was it sleep paralysis? A vivid nightmare superimposed onto reality? Is it possible to sleepwalk in space? Or rather, sleep float? No. He pushed the thoughts away decisively. He knew what he had seen. It was real. Maybe we should report this to Earth? Marcus suggested, looking at Arthur with that same strange, probing expression. If you're sure you heard something serious. His voice sounded normal, friendly, but Arthur thought he detected a faint, false note. I'm sure, Arthur said firmly, meeting Commander Eva Rostova's eyes. He didn't go into detail about what he'd seen outside the window. Telling them now about a dead Marcus and a black tentacle, especially with a living Marcus standing right there, would have sounded like the ravings of a lunatic. He only described the strange tapping and the subsequent scraping, mentioning that the sound came from outside the station. Eva listened attentively, then glanced at Marcus and the others. All right, we'll report it to Mission Control. Have them run diagnostics on the external systems and the hull, just in case. Everyone agreed. Contact with Houston was established quickly. Arthur briefly reported the unexplained sounds, omitting the most shocking details. The operator on the ground acknowledged the information, promising an immediate full check of all station systems and telemetry. For a while, the crew waited near the main control console for the results. The tension was palpable. Everyone tried to act normally, but an undercurrent of anxiety was perceptible. Arthur tried not to look at Marcus, but caught his glances out of the corner of his eye. He was acting completely normal, chatting with Lena Petrova about the air revitalization system, checking some readings on a monitor. But Arthur constantly felt that beneath this mask of normalcy, something else lurked. That faint ripple under the skin. Had he imagined it? Finally, the response came back from Houston. The full diagnostics revealed no anomalies. All systems were operating nominally, no hull damage recorded, micrometeoroid impact sensors were quiet. The only oddity noted during the night, while the crew slept, sensors on the external airlock, the one used for spacewalks, registered a brief opening and subsequent closing. Someone had opened the outer hatch and closed it again moments later. None of the crew admitted to doing it. Everyone denied having gone near the airlock. This news hung in the air, followed by a heavy silence. Opening the airlock. That would have been enough time to eject someone. Arthur went cold. His suspicions found horrifying confirmation. What he had seen wasn't a dream. Marcus Bell really had been murdered and thrown overboard. And the one standing beside them now, the one who looked like Marcus, talked like Marcus, but wasn't him. It had taken his place. After that incident, a strange calm settled over the station. Awkwardness and suspicion lingered in the interactions between crew members, though no one voiced their fears openly. But the most surprising thing was, the disappearances stopped. Food, water, personal items ceased to vanish. Supplies were once again sufficient for exactly 10 people. As if that unseen stowaway, which had caused so much anxiety, had suddenly evaporated. Or as if it no longer needed to steal. It had eliminated one crew member and taken his place, gaining access to all necessary resources. Arthur felt trapped. He had no proof, only his own testimony, which could easily be dismissed as hallucination or stress-induced delusion. He couldn't tell anyone the truth without risking being labeled delusional or paranoid. But he knew. He had seen. And now he had to spend the remainder of the mission side by side with the creature that had murdered his crewmate and now wore his face. The remaining weeks in orbit became an agonizing ordeal for Arthur. Every day he was forced to interact with the entity wearing Marcus Bell's face. He watched it constantly, searching for slip-ups, inconsistencies, any sign of what hid beneath the stolen exterior. Sometimes he thought he caught something, a fleeting cold glint in the eyes, a reaction too quick, too inhuman, a barely perceptible tremor in the skin of its hand when Marcus thought no one was looking. But these were only flickers, too uncertain to serve as proof. The entity was an incredibly skilled mimic. It perfectly copied the real Marcus's mannerisms, voice, habits, even his jokes. It knew his job, his duties, his past, at least the parts that could be gleaned from conversations and personal files. The other crew members, it seemed, noticed nothing. The initial tension after the airlock incident gradually subsided, replaced by routine. The end of the disappearances had reassured most of them, who attributed the past oddities to collective stress or some unidentified glitch. Arthur found himself isolated, alone with his knowledge and his fear. He couldn't trust anyone. Any careless word could turn against him. The entity might sense a threat and eliminate him just as it had eliminated Marcus. So Arthur played his part, the role of a normal colleague, a little tired perhaps, but doing his job. He interacted with Marcus, worked side by side with the imposter, even exchanged occasional pleasantries, though every word cost him enormous effort. He meticulously documented all his observations, even the most minor ones, encrypting the entries in his personal log. He knew he could do nothing while still on the station. He had neither the authority nor the means to expose the imposter. His only chance was to wait for the return to Earth. There, under the scrutiny of normal gravity, under the observation of doctors and security personnel, perhaps something could be done. Perhaps the entity wouldn't be able to maintain its perfect disguise outside the familiar environment of zero gravity. Or perhaps a medical examination would reveal anomalies. Arthur knew it was a faint hope, but it was all he had. He had to survive. He had to get back. He had to warn the world. Because he had no doubt. The entity that had killed Marcus and taken his place wasn't the only one. That black tentacle he had seen outside the window, it belonged to something far larger, something dwelling out there, in the void. And if they could infiltrate the space station, mimic humans so expertly, then what was to stop them from infiltrating Earth? Who knew how many might already be here, among us, living side by side, wearing the faces of acquaintances, friends, colleagues, body snatchers, shapeshifters, doppelgangers. Whatever names they went by in old legends and modern nightmares, the essence was the same. They were alien, they were predators, and they were dangerous. Arthur didn't know what he would do once he was back on Earth. How could he prove he was right? How could he make people believe something so incredible? But he knew one thing. He would watch Marcus. He would watch its every move. And he would be ready. The mission was nearing its end. Return was imminent. But for Arthur, the real struggle was just beginning. A struggle for the truth, for survival, perhaps for the future of all humankind. He looked at the Earth approaching in the window, his heart tightening with foreboding. The danger wasn't just out there, in space. Perhaps the greatest danger was already waiting for them down below. And the cardinal rule he had learned in orbit: never, under any circumstances, let them inside. Because then, it would already be too late.